church and mission. And we'll be workshop style, so I'll talk for bits. I've got some videos, I've got some arts and craft for you to do. Everyone loves that. We've got some discussion and some group work. So we'll try and mix it up, because if it's the same method, then we get a bit weary of that. So we've got 2 slots looking at that before and after the tea break mid-morning. And then this afternoon we're going to think about leaders, how we develop and release leaders. And I want to kind of give you a way of thinking about it that I think will fit your context, but we can say a bit more about that. So that's why I particularly want to focus on how we might raise up lay leaders and release them and develop them to be involved in mission in the parish through new churches. So in this session we're going to look at that, and I wonder if we could start with this question. Every church was once planted. You might not use that word, you might say started, founded, established, it began. But every church, your church, the church you've been, every church you've been part of, had a time, an occasion when it began. And it will have a story as to why that happened. I told you the story of G2, which started in 2004, and its story was the vicar had an idea: what if we did a church in a gym? Would different people come? So that was our story. We've got churches where I live that were started because the leaders had a disagreement about something that seemed incredibly important to them, like whether the prayers come at the beginning or the end of the service, world-changing issues like that, that became insurmountable, and so they resolved it in the best way they could imagine, which was to go their separate ways. And so we had churches that are started out of division. I'm sure you don't have any of those. You may have churches that were established out of population growth, and periods when new estates opened up, or places increased, or people came in from other countries. So there may be a whole variety of reasons. So I wonder if you want to just turn to somebody next to you in a pair, if you can, and just for a couple of minutes, just say, what is the story of the church that you're in? I don't mean the denomination or the diocese that I'm thinking of now, but just the local church that you are in. What's the story of that? And I'll get some of you to share in a minute when you've done that.
First parish I was in Franklin there, was another one. Like, that was great bigger, it was a new suburb. Yeah, and often I think there's been a new suburb. So it initially started by being a church for a central worship here, so the vicar had ridden over. And when it gets big enough, they get their own business. People started off as a daughter of another parish, and then when I was in the vicar used to ride over and sometimes I would sleep there on Saturday night. Yeah. And it was, the weird characters. That was like, you get a central worship here, rather than and when it gets big enough, it's very narrative.
Okay, I'd love to hear some of those stories. Let me give you another one. I was on holiday in France this year, and I went to visit a place called St. Is it switched on? I think so. Can I leave you to sort it out? Yeah. So I went to a place called St Hild because it was beautiful, nice little island. So my wife and I went just to have a wander around, and picked up a leaflet in the church. What was the story of St Hild? In the 14th century, a Welshman, where's my Welsh friend? A Welshman had, have I got it wrong? Caddock.
Who was a missionary.
Yeah. Had a vision that he should go to Brittany, which would have been a very long way in that day to have taken on that journey. So he went on his pilgrimage, came to this place that was named after him, and he prayed for somebody who was deaf in one ear, and the Lord healed her. And they said, "You should stay, we'd like more." And that was the establishing of their church. Let's hear a few more. We don't want the long version, okay? We want the condensed version. Let's hear from a few of you. Yes.
I'm parish of Mount Maunganui, so St Peter's, which is actually down at the Mount, came out of this parish, Holy Trinity, and then St Mary's, which is where my office is, came out of St Peter's, and there was another church that came out of St Peter's, which was at Amanu as well. So that's this church planting.
That's a lovely family tree of.
And then if you want to go further, Pakamore East Anglican Church came out of parish of Mount Maunganui, and Adrian and Arthur will be able to tell you more about that.
Yeah. Let's hear another. We need a few.
Tupuki also is a plant from town.
Okay. That's brilliant. Yes, sir.
So Great Part up the road. It's kind of a plant of Holy Trinity, but it's two bits of the story. One is the people of Great Part and Gresham couldn't be bothered coming all the way down to Holy Trinity to go to church. They really just wanted their own church. But also they were, a number of them were soldiers who fought in the Battle of Great Part, and they wanted a memorial church on the battle site to remember the British soldiers who died there. And it was another 60 years before they fought. Maybe we should also remember the Māori Anglicans and others who died here as well. So it's but more of a convoluted story.
Yeah. Some more?
Parish of Waiapu was another plant from Holy Trinity. Because of population growth in the 50s.
Yeah.
60s.
That's great. Was the lady there?
Because we've both been vicars of Taupo, we talked about Taupo's story, and St Andrews was really a church plant from St James, which is a Tikanga Māori church in Nukuho. And those of you who know the area will know that St Paul's in Tikanga and St James Nukuho and Oronoi, St Matthews were all there, and then St Andrews came, I think, in the early 1930s. But we missed a half of the story yesterday, because I reckon we talked about the Pākehā Church, but we didn't talk about the Māori evangelists who were so important to the Waiapu story. For example, we were lucky enough to go and hear about the martyrs Kiriapa and Manahiri recently, and they died in 1847, which was 5 years after Selwyn arrived. He was our first bishop. But they had been farewelled on their missionary journey by 1,000 Maori in Taranaki. So there's a whole another part of the church planting story that I think we missed yesterday.
Yeah, that sounds incredible. Let's have a couple more.
This church was like a direct spiritual descent from the missionaries that came here in 1836. And then there was the disconnect with the wars. And this church was started as a settler church immediately after that. So it's a spiritual connection between those two.
Yeah, thank you. At the back.
I'll give you one from where I come, which is totally different. Church not at all established for a community, but because the Christian individual got sick of all of these saints who were hermits and got sick of all the chatter of the isolated place. So he found somewhere even more isolated. Unfortunately, people started to get drawn to him, and it's not exactly what he wanted. But he established a community there, but in order to keep separation between him and the community, he built a fence. And that fence in Welsh is Bangor, and that's the name of the place. And it commemorates the fence between him and the community, between the tackle and the non-tackle, between the holy and the non-holy. So completely different, not at all established for a community.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I'm sure there are more stories. We've made that a simple point that church planting isn't new. The vocabulary, the terminology may be new, and people will prefer different vocabulary, and that's absolutely fine. Find what works for you. But the idea that churches were founded usually for the purposes of mission is our apostolic story. So in discovering and learning afresh about church planting, we're not doing something, it's not an act of desperation, you know, oh gosh, we must do something. And it's not a newly invented set of ideas. We are actually rediscovering what those pioneers that went before us did. For some of them, it was an entirely normal expression of their Christian faith. I want you to hold the positiveness of what we've just shared as we drop back to where we ended yesterday. And we went through the doom statistics. I shared you mine from the UK, and you said things about the statistics here. We're very similar in terms of the decline of the church. And I don't know if it's necessary, but it's correct to acknowledge that we are in a challenging place. Stephen Bullivant, who's a Roman Catholic researcher, statistician at St Mary's University in Twickenham, says there's Christianity in Europe as a default, as a norm, is gone, and probably gone for good, or at least for the next 100 years. He says Christianity in Europe is moribund. It's died. A commentator on the statistics that I showed you yesterday, he said the church, as in the church in England, in its present form, will have to die. It is dying. To engage with that, I think we need to learn how to deal with two stories that are intertwined. In my book, shameless plug, in the book, I begin with this quote from Charles Dickens and The Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Sometimes the averages don't help us. Sometimes we do need to dig into the local stories. It is inevitable in my nation that we will continue to see decline of certain forms for at least one more decade, if not longer. It's inevitable. The age profile, the trajectory we've been on, that slice of the story is almost set, and we might be able to adjust it a bit, but it will go where it goes. But we also have another emerging story of churches being revitalised, churches being replanted, of new forms and new expressions of church, of mission leading to new forms of church being established. And so we need to grasp that at the same time, two things are happening. I find often in England in clergy meetings, people sort of seem to sit in one camp or the other and often lack the vocabulary or the dynamic to be able to acknowledge we have challenges and we have wonderful things happening at the same time. So as we engage with this ministry, we bear responsibility for what we've inherited, and that was acknowledged already in this session. But the decline of the church that we're in began before we were ever involved in ministry. So in a sense, we've inherited a story for which we now carry some responsibility, but we also have responsibility and opportunities for new things and new choices that we make moving forward. I wonder what your view of the church is. 3 quotes, 3 options of how you might put that together. The first requires an explanation. It came from the Archdeacon of Brighton, and it relates to a discussion around a church called St Peter's. St Peter's was the largest parish church in the city, as big as a medium-sized cathedral, and it had declined, and it was proposed that it should be closed. The bishop wanted it to close, the archdeacon wanted it to close, the area dean wanted it to close, the vicar wanted it to close, and the church council wanted it to close. Everybody wanted it to close, and it was proposed that it should close. But the local population didn't want it to close, and they started a petition to keep it open. Oh, the irony that those who were not involved in that local church felt it had still an importance for their community. And that became an opportunity for a church plant, and in fact one of the most successful plants in recent years in terms of planting out further from then. I think they're now up to 9 plants that have come out of St Peter's as a result of that revitalisation. The Archdeacon involved, as he reflected, because he clearly went on a journey himself, as he reflected as the new church was about to be launched and all the energy and vibrancy that went with it, said this: an empty church is like the empty palace of a long forgotten king. And people walk past and say, the king is dead. So we have a lot of that where I live. Churches that say, the king died a long time ago. Closed. T.S. Eliot, the poet, in the choruses at the end of the play The Rock, says this: the church must be forever building and always decaying and always being restored. That's interesting, isn't it? What an interesting mix. Building and decaying and being restored. Living things, as you know, have all sorts of things going on. In families, some are getting older and weaker and frailer, and then maybe there's a new member of the family, and there's change here. And so we don't see that change as bad. We don't imagine that we stay in the same state. If we are a family of churches, then we'll be seeing perhaps building, and at the same time change, and at the same time decline. The third quote, one of my favourites that perhaps refers to church planting, is from the mission bishop Irenaeus. He was a Greek. He went to France, and in his treatise against heresies in AD 180, one of probably the first patristic possible mention of church planting, said this: the church is planted like paradise in this world. What a beautiful idea. Do you think about your church in that way, that your church is a planting of paradise in your local community. Who wouldn't want that? Who wouldn't want to be involved in supporting and encouraging that and spreading more of that around? So that wherever people are, for every group of people, there is a planting of God's holy paradise in their community and where they live. Okay, back to you, a couple of minutes. I'd love you just to, which of those do you gravitate to you? Which do you think, actually let's make it like this, which do you feel, which is where you are now? Which one sums up where you are now? The mixed one in the middle, the hyper positive one at the bottom, the negative and gloomy one at the top. Over to you for 2 minutes on your tables.
But also, there's one too, it's kind of the abundance of hope and also it can always be something that will come out of Uranus is like
Okay, let's press on. I think you like to talk, yeah. That's nice. It's a nice feel, but I'll need to manage my time, so I'll keep my eye on the clock. What I'm hoping to do in the rest of this session is to set the table theologically, in simple theological terms, in terms of what do we bring to this idea of church planting. And really we're going to look at the two ingredients, mission and the church. So that's what we're talking about in this first session. The quote on the screen is from the Presbyterian J.D. Payne. He says this: church planting is located at the intersection of ecclesiology and missiology. I like that, and most writers on church planting say something to that effect. I've got a few others here. Stuart Murray says church planting can legitimately be subsumed under the theological disciplines of missiology and ecclesiology. Stefan Pass, Dutch theologian, quite critical of church planting, but he says this: church planting is a source of reflection on church and mission. That's interesting, isn't it? That church planting might serve the whole church by helping us to think and reflect upon our mission and upon our practice and forms of church. We've already done scripts. So sometimes I think of church planting a bit like this, that there are two significant pillars that are feeding into the thing that we're labelling church planting. It is the mission of the church, and it's the church, the formation of the church. And as Stuart Payne says, it's when we can bring those together, the spark when those touch, perhaps, that's the thing that ignites a new Christian community, the people of God in a place or for a context that's born out of the mission of God to this world through Jesus Christ. I think there's also a third ingredient, which is to do with people. Why are churches not the same? Why isn't every church identical? We have similarities, we have things that are in common, but actually no two churches represented here, local churches, will be the same. Why is that? It's because there's a different story of people involved. So if you like, we have some doctrinal, some solid pillars that undergird the foundations of the establishing of churches. But we have something that's fluid and dynamic, that's interpretive, that helps us to understand or decide what might a church look like in this place or with these people. And people, what might that include? It might include the people that live in that place, or the people you're endeavouring to reach. Maybe you want to reach students. It includes their history, perhaps. I had a friend in Sheffield who's starting a church, and he did some research to find out about the people and the story. And what he found out is that the people in this place have suffered generations of broken promises, despair, and being let down. And I think he quite rightly perceived that whatever they did as a church needed to attend to that. It needed to somehow make a meaningful connection with the fact that the people who live here feel let down, and their parents felt let down, and their parents' parents felt let down. So that's good mission in practice, understanding the story of people, understanding the people that you want to reach. I think other groups are relevant. I think the person that's leading the church and the team, that shapes a church. I think it's right that you lead out of who you are, and you will hope to do the best you can, but no two of us are the same. So if we each went to the same place, we would inevitably lead it with differences. And that's okay, because it's contextual, and that context includes us. And then with that, it's also shaped by the people we connect with. I used to say to our team, every time a new person walks in the door, we are a different church. Because we are a local community, so who we are, what we are, and the gifts that God has given us, and the things that are particularly important or how they're prioritised in our context, is inevitably shaped in a huge way by the congregation. So every time there's a new person or some, any movement or shift in that, the identity of the church will shift. I struggled to find a good picture for this. I should have got Carl to draw me something, but I wonder if it could be a bit like this, that you've got two colours, mission and church, missiology and ecclesiology, and then the people's story, that all those aspects that I've just outlined are like the brush with which we paint. So when we're involved in good church planting, we're very attentive to those elements. We can't. Do you have IKEA here?
No.
Nearly.
No.
No.
It's coming to Auckland soon.
Oh, I am sorry.
Yeah.
Praise the Lord.
Yeah.
Well, we have the Swedish furniture company IKEA. We used to call it IKEA, and then they did a whole new advert, and they told us we have to say IKEA. So we all say IKEA now. I only go because they do great meatballs and chips. They're just around the corner from my college, so that's all I'm interested in. But some fear that church planting is like IKEA, a mass-produced flat pack, simple, idiot-proof. You just sort of screw through 3 things together and ta-da, we have a church plant and everyone is exactly the same. So that really doesn't work. It doesn't work missionally, and it's certainly not true to the commission we've been given by Jesus and God. So church planting is something of an artistic adventure, and actually my book, a third of my book, is dedicated to thinking about the role of artistry and creativity in training and in producing new churches. Because I actually think that it's deeply important that we get that part of it right. To be contextual, to be contextually authentic, then actually what we need to be is to approach it not like scientists or engineers, but like artisans who have been taught to paint, but know that no 2 pictures will be the same. I can't tell you what I'll paint here, but I can tell you that I understand how to do a painting, and I'll know what the painting should look like when I get to that place. So I'm trying to just put, maybe labouring the point too much, but I'm trying to put together these 2 beautiful things that God has given us: his church and his mission. One of my other favourite quotes about church planting is Tim Tennant, who says this: church planting is nothing less than evangelism in community. That's a nice way to say it, isn't it? It's evangelism in community. I know what it means to maybe share my faith as an individual, but maybe if a bunch of us work together and we want to do it in a way of community, then perhaps that form of evangelism can lead to a new community being formed. That would be a church plant. And Jesus also, interestingly, didn't say much about the church. The word church is only on the lips of Jesus 3 times, only recorded by Matthew. We heard it in the earlier session, the same quote where he says to Peter, "I will build my church, and I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." I like that text a lot because I think it fuels imagination in terms of what flows into church planting. The Gospels predominantly speak to this idea of the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. And this is the verse where Jesus sort of brings it together. I almost feel like he's saying, just you do the kingdom of heaven stuff. You really go for that. I've explained it. I've laboured it. I've given you many illustrations of how God wants to work in our societies. And from that, church will get built. I almost wonder if, and maybe I'm reading a little bit too much into it, I wonder if he's giving Peter a bit of demarcation and he's saying, listen carefully, I build the church, you do the kingdom. Okay? I wonder if he's even saying, don't try and make church. That's my job. I'll sort that out. You do the kingdom.
Yeah.
You be out there talking about Jesus, doing the works of God, healing the sick and comforting those who are grieving, and all those things that are rich to us in the gospel, that we plough into that and we allow from that Jesus to build his church. So we'll chat about mission and we'll chat about church in a minute. Let's talk about mission. Let's have a little chat at our tables. Who does your church reach? Who do you reach at the moment? You may say that's a struggle, or you may feel, actually there are certain groups we work quite well with. Or it might be, as we said yesterday, it's people similar to us. We connect with people similar to us. Who do you reach? Who do you not reach? Now we'll press into that in a minute when we get the papers and the pens out, etc. Second question, if you like. Where are you seeing signs of hope? Perhaps even small signs of hope. A lot of the kingdom of God was about seeds, wasn't it? Tiny seeds that can in time produce enormous results. A little bit of yeast that can spread through the whole batch, etc. So seeds, tiny glimmers of hope can be incredibly important things to notice and see. A third question, what are your greatest challenges for mission? Okay. 5 minutes on tables for that? Over to you.
And no one's making it we are kind of and I think it's sort of like we class themselves as the maybe not just church, they call themselves the church directly, but if they start cutting people like us, then and we have the signs of that. always started to come along. Sometimes it's confusing, sometimes it's like, and it's like, and in my parish, I wasn't doing something else because they started to come along.
Okay. So we're talking about mission and talking about the church. When I get students to explore ideas to do with possibilities for new forms of church, we often look at definitions of a church. They can be helpful or unhelpful. I've got two for you that, if you like, could be bookends for a spectrum within which we could cast our imagination. So the first comes from the Book of Common Prayer. Actually, it's older than that. It comes from the Articles of Religion. Do you know what those are?
I suppose so.
Have you got them, or did you get better ones? Because ours are actually not.
We got better ones now.
Yeah, you got better ones. So well done.
We still have to sign up to them.
But in the Articles of Religion, there is a definition of prayer. Article 19. The visible Church of Christ is a congregation of faithful men and women in which the pure word of God is preached and the sacraments duly administered according to Christ's ordinance. So that's, yes, a few minimal requirements that might be necessary for something to be a church. It's a congregation. That doesn't say how many people, maybe just a handful. There's no mention of a minister in there, actually, or an ordained person. So that's
duly ministered where we would bring that in.
Yeah. Well, somebody's doing something, but it doesn't necessarily say you must have an ordained leader. No. We might infer that, but it doesn't say that. Where the word of God is preached, we're not told necessarily in what form that is.
But pure, they had a lot of arguments about pure.
What's the word?
Yeah.
That's what the key word there.
Yeah.
You should have put a bracket around.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm an academic. I can't tell you. I've got to leave it in there.
You bring out the Book of Common Prayer and everyone gets passionate.
In our coffee break, we will debate what is the pure word of God. We should be able to resolve that in 30 minutes quite easily. And the sacraments, which I assume from the context means baptism and Holy Communion, are duly administered. I note that it is permissible for a lay person to baptise.
Only an emergency.
And I would always add, when I say that in England, as long as your bishop's happy. And some of our bishops are happy, some are not happy. But there is some possibilities in there, and as you say, an emergency, or I'd say sometimes an accidental baptism. You know, we accidentally baptised. Weekend, Father, was it okay? Yes, it's okay. And then Holy Communion, and you'll know in ancient times, often people didn't often have communion that often. Sometimes it was just twice a year. So the idea of a weekly communion is kind of in the Second World War, or certainly the turn of the century. Before that, communion was a rare thing, and something like matins would have been seen as the main service to attend. Anyway, all good history. An interesting starting point of are there some minimal ingredients which might be enough for us to say this is not just a group of people, this is a church, or this is something that's on a direction towards becoming a church.
So perhaps the most fundamental thing about that was that was massively cutting down on the definition of church in the historical context. Right, over against the argument of everything the Catholic Church brought along, all the way up to the Bishop of Rome. To say this is the church was to cut it down to two things. You've got church if you've got two things going on. That was pretty radical.
Yeah.
And that was a growth point, to be able to say, as long as we're doing these two things, we are church.
Yeah.
Whatever it's otherwise we differ, that is church. And maybe we have to do a similar mental process of cutting down to what the living essentials are.
Well, I agree with that, because we are encumbered by trappings of church that have the danger of holding us back from recognising what God might want to do. What you said earlier is a historical question. I don't know enough to answer that. I know that the articles have a lot of attitude in them. They're against a lot of things. So there could be some attitude in this, for all I know. The second was the one made by Rowan Williams, which he actually he regretted. Not that he disagreed with it, but he didn't realise the problems he would cause by putting this in the introduction to Mission Church. But he speculated, if church is what happens when people encounter the risen Jesus and commit themselves to sustaining and deepening that encounter and their encounter with each other. Sorry, I've read that wrong, you put it on the screen. So a very different, not so functional, a bit more operative idea. He's saying there's a group of people, and if they are encountering the risen Jesus and they are exploring that together, perhaps that's church. Or perhaps that's an authentic beginning of church to which other things might happen. And if you're familiar with any of the discussions around things like fresh expressions, they kind of use the sense of trajectory as in something that has the potential to become. So they're not looking at the seed saying you are not a flower. They're saying you have the potential. The seedling has the potential to be the flower. We don't look at a baby and say you are height challenged. We know you're going to grow because you're a human. So, and where you are right now is entirely consistent for where you are right now, but we also know you will probably go in a certain direction and you will have the marks and the appearance of church.
Why did Rowan get in trouble for that?
What was that, sorry?
Why did Rowan get in trouble for that statement?
No, he didn't get in trouble. He regretted it. Partly because I think he's a person that thinks phenomenally. And also, his challenge, which I've heard him speak about, was he was an academic trying to lead a denomination. The denomination wanted decisive decisions, and as an academic, he wanted to lay out the portfolio of the range of beliefs, as someone would say, as we heard in the earlier Bible study. The answer to the question is, well, there are many opinions on this. Let me lay them out for you. So I think that's what he sort of regretted. I also think he didn't anticipate how big a thing this would be in our church in England, that it would have a powerful reforming effect. And certainly the whole Fresh Expressions movement and Mission Church has permanently changed the culture of our church significantly, away from a very rigid and inflexible view that it has to be in a parish-shaped model with all the trappings for it to be legitimate. That people don't think like that now, and I think that report was primarily responsible for that.
It's happened in the Scottish Church as well, Scottish Episcopal Church.
Not as much.
Not as much, but it has happened. Well, certainly in the Diocese of St Andrews, it was. I don't know what it's happening under the current bishop, but it was in the Diocese of St Andrews.
Yeah, it is happening. I think it's happening more slowly though. And sorry, just to labour, I want to set the scene. So this is a quote from Fresh Expression. New mission initiatives have the potential to become a mature expression of church, shaped by the gospel and the enduring marks of the church, which refers to the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic. Those are the enduring marks of the church for its cultural context. So touching some of the things that we've said already, but also that idea of it grows into, it has the potential to become something. Graham Cray, who lives a few miles from me, he's a good friend, was actually the author of Mission Church, said this: it's clear to us that the parochial system remains an essential and central part of the National Church's strategy to deliver incarnational mission, but the existing parochial system alone is no longer able to fully deliver its underlying mission purpose. We need to recognise that a variety of integrated missionary approaches is now required. A mixed economy of parish churches and network churches will be necessary in an active partnership across a wide area, perhaps a deanery. And that for us was the beginning of the revolution, that we needed to not just engage with parish and support that, something that will never go away, but we also needed to empower other forms of church that might even be experimental, which would work alongside and collaboratively with the parish system. Last quote from Ron Williams again: "We may discern signs of hope. They may be found particularly in the development of a mixed economy of church life. There are ways of being church alongside the inherited parochial pattern." So if you'd like, we might get to a kind of tentative idea of what a church plant could be. Church planting is creating new communities of Christian faith as part of the mission of God to express his kingdom in every geographic and cultural context. There are lots of definitions. That's probably a useful one. It pulls together things we've talked about: the kingdom, communities of faith, not just mission projects. We'll talk later about how we need to think not just in terms of geography in the modern world. Geography was sufficient in an older age, but in the modern world, people work in different ways, people connect in different ways. And that idea that church has a cultural context, that no two churches are the same because no two contexts are the same. Well, I'll run through a little taxonomy of church planting and how's your interest? Do you? Okay. What I want to convey here is huge variety. Often when I work with bishops in England, what I discover is they know of one church plant. And Margaret Thatcher famously said, "A little knowledge is a dangerous thing." I'm sure she didn't say that. I think it was probably Alexandra Pope or something like that. A bishop with a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing. So what's key is actually, when we're talking about church planting, we are talking about a massive spectrum. By the way, I'll happily send you my slides, so if you want to quote, if that helps and saves you some writing. So I think on the left, we perhaps can categorise most types of church plant. Number one, I call a multiplication. That's when, and we heard about it earlier, a church that already exists was involved in seeding a church down the road or in another place. And that probably meant a group of people went. So it's a sort of a multiplication, just like a cell multiplies. And multiplied churches often are similar. The child is similar to the parent. Usually they're a bit more modern in style, you know, maybe the music clicks forward 10 years or something like that. Maybe button shirt becomes t-shirt, or you know, those kinds of change. But you could but a bit like in a family, you can recognise, oh yes, I can see you came from that church. So that's one form of church planting, and certainly in the 1980s, in the 1980s, that was the most common form of church planting in my nation. Yes, sir.
Just a question around that, please, if I may.
Yeah.
I guess there's a lot of cultural baggage around that model, the HTB model in particular.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing my question is, has it learnt to recognise the context it's going into rather than bringing the context that it's come from with it?
Yeah. Has
it grown up and become an adult mechanism rather than a child taking their toys to another place and playing in the same way?
Yes.
Do you see what I mean?
Yeah. So, in its worst incarnation, it's IKEA church.
Yeah.
It's cut and paste, that'll do, which is what the critics that you're suggesting would be focusing on. In its best incarnation, then it's a church that takes the strength of things they already know how to do and be, and some of their shared experience that the team have. So they can kind of start, they don't start at the beginning as strangers with no story. They actually have something they can begin with. And then hopefully they also understand that they must be resolutely attentive to contextualize. That they almost hold their story with incredible humility, knowing this is where we're starting, but this won't be where we are in a year or 2 years from that. And I'd argue the HTB churches, that does happen over about 5 years or so. Often they look identical when they're started, even the names of the children's groups and all that, and that leads people to think, oh, this is so unimaginative, so little thought has been put into that. But often after about 5 years, they have become truly a church for that place, connected with the story that's there. Does that help? The second is a replant. That's the most common form of church planting we're doing in England at the moment. A church that already exists, that has either closed or is imminent to closing, and it is brought to a fresh life through essentially a church planting-like intervention. So technically it's not a new church. The church there already exists. It has a name, it has a story, but it's, I don't know, a bit like a restaurant that comes under new management. It was an Italian restaurant before, it still is, but there's a new chef. And they've updated the tablecloths, and you know, there's no longer salmonella, and so that's a replant, and that's actually at the moment most of our church planting is actually replanting. It's actually harder to replant than it is to plant fresh, because not only must you have all the abilities to be able to pioneer and innovate, you must also have all the diplomacy necessary to work authentically with those that are there, if you're going to do well by them. So you actually need double skills to be able to do that. Church planters often aren't great diplomats. Pioneers are often not great diplomats. So actually it can be a challenge to find somebody who can do those two parts really well. The third I've just called a pioneer, which is where the thing that starts actually is an authentically new thing. The people that are involved may have come from one church, or they may have been drawn from different places, but they've thought very carefully about what they're going to do, and they've created something that isn't a copy or even a similarity to where they've come from. They've discerned, either because of them or because of the people that they need to reach, that they will do something in a different way. That was the story of G2, the one I told you. A trad parish church thought, what if we did church in a gym? What might happen there? That was definitely a pioneering thing. We were not drawing on the identity of the thing that was planting us out. Then I think, furthermore, you can categorise some of the churches in different ways. We have things called resource churches, and these are churches designated by the bishop to play a supportive, resourcing role in church planting beyond their parish. They're part of the means by which we might actually be able to resource church planting. And that might be by being a centre of excellence, a place of training. It might be that they're sending out leaders. It often means there's a financial investment. It's a church that's saying we want to invest in this financially. It might be in the ongoing, so that people that are planted out, it isn't just sort of good luck, but it's like a family thing. My daughter last night, she bought a house. Did I tell you she bought a house?
No.
It's her birthday today. She couldn't understand that it's her birthday here, but it's not her birthday at home. I'll ring it tonight. And she bought a house. My wife and I are not going to leave her on her own. I got a phone call at 4 a.m. today to say, Dad, do I need insurance? Yes, you do. I'll sort that out for you, don't worry. So we need to be like that in church planting as well. That the bad days were when we sent 2 people off and hoped they did okay. We also need to build networks that support the baby churches and help them grow into maturity and help them grow into the fullness of their identity. A proto-church, probably a terrible name, but is maybe an experiment. It's something that's not yet a church, but it's that fresh expressions idea. It has a potential to grow into something, but right now that's not where it is. Maybe we wouldn't technically give it the label of church, but it is something. It's an initiative. It's like, you've planted a seed and you're just waiting to see what might happen. I did this a lot with small groups. We had a culture and a system where anyone in the church could start a small group, and these were groups that would have an outward-looking focus. And many of them ran for a season and then stopped. But some of them were kind of good ideas in the right place at the right time, and they stuck, and they grew into something. And the key thing is you don't know up front what will happen. You need to scatter the seed and see what grows, and then be attentive to that. And then microchurch, lots of different names. Microchurch, DMM, have you heard of those? Disciple making movements. Maybe even ideas like cell church that you've heard of before. But these would be churches that predominantly are based in homes and very minimal. The minimum to be a church. Lay-led, not ordained leadership, maybe ordained oversight, perhaps not sacramental even, maybe just meeting for a Bible study, for prayer, for encouragement, and existing for mission. And interestingly, I worked with the Yorkshire Baptist Association, who are connected with our college, and they launched two micro churches, two in this DMM, disciple making movement, in this DMM model, just before the first lockdown in England. And then they did a review a year later of everything that they had at the church, and they concluded that their existing models of church, in a building, Sunday, a normal Baptist church, had cost the same, had declined, and had not seen any missional growth. The DMMs that they started had continued to cost nothing, had grown rapidly to 40 groups.
Whoa.
And had reached over 60 people, many of whom were from cultures and contexts that their churches had previously never touched. So they'd reached Muslim people, people from Southeast Asia, different religions, people in Bradford and areas like that. So that for them caught their attention, that's an interesting model of church planting. And I know churches that run a hybrid where they have Sunday and they also have churches in homes as well. And if you're in the church in homes, you don't do Sunday because your church is in the home, but it's one church, just multiple expressions. Then on the right, we need to, and we said this already, we need to attend to the context. So for centuries, church has been local, and it makes complete sense. Nobody's got a car, cars don't exist. A few people have got a horse, but so if you're going to church, you will walk there. So that's why we have a parish system. I mean, where I live in York, every 10 steps you can find a church. That's because they fell out with each other. But the idea is that everyone had a local church. You lived within the sound of that bell. So you wouldn't know what time it is because you don't have a watch. Don't exist. You hear the bell and you know it's time for church. We've got enough time to walk. So that's served well. But we're actually in a society where not everyone is ordered around where they live. A lot of people in their 20s, for example, might work in a particular sector. So I'm involved in a church now that's reaching people through their working lives. And our thesis is where they live might change quite frequently. because they're probably renting a room in a shared house, or they're a lodger, and that might change maybe even once a year. But where they work, either this company or the next company, will probably keep them located within a very tight geographic area, and probably a constant or fairly constant set of relationships. So for that narrow window of their life, it makes no sense that we try and reach them through where they live, because they're not particularly connected to that. They're connected to their social friends, the network of friends that they have, and where they are through their working life. So for example, our services are not on Sunday, they're midweek. We do morning prayer on the way into the office. We do courses in the evening after work. We do short Eucharistic services during the day that people can come to in their lunch break, have sandwiches while they're participating. So we must be attentive not just to where people live, but where they work. And at different seasons, people then do connect locally. Often when people, if they get married, they buy a house, if they start a family, suddenly people become geographically local again. Young families are looking for a local church that they can go to, and they're also highly connected with all the other people local who are at the same stage of life as them. Third is where people study, whether that's college or university years, and that's probably one of the most significant mission opportunities that we have in terms of reaching people at that point when they're working out who they are and they're in a very tight network of people. I reckon our best missional spending as a church was on a half-time student worker. And with a half-time student worker, we reckon we had about 100 students involved in the church, and probably a fringe of about 300. And they were highly networked. If one came to faith, we'd be like, yes, we're going to have a baptism on Sunday. The whole service is going to be about the baptism. You know, there'll be baptism biscuits, baptism drinks, it'll be a baptism talk. We'll put the baptistry in the middle of the room. There'll be a video about baptism. The sermon will be about baptism. And at the end, I'll ask who else wants to be baptized. And we'd go for that. And the reason was we knew all their friends will come. And they're highly networked. And so it was like dominoes often. You know, the friend that came became the next person that explored their faith, and then they got baptized in due course. So where people study is key. And then the last two, networks through how people socialise. So again, people in their 20s or different age groups may be more connected to their social group of friends, their peer group, their age group, than their geography and where they live. And then the last one is digital, of course, which is the new one we're all learning. I don't think the wisdom has landed on that in terms of how we do digital and hybrid. What does it look like for our churches to be in person and also have other ways of connecting in the same way that we all find quite normal, don't we? If you live with somebody, have you ever rung them during the day? I mean, that's a hybrid, isn't it? It's a digital hybrid. You don't go, well, I'm not really with my wife. Now I'm just speaking to a detached voice on a machine. You don't think like that. You just think, this is a person I know. We were together this morning. We're communicating now. I'll see you later. And so there's probably an argument that that's how all of us should be thinking about how we do church. Okay. Let's breathe and let's have a second discussion about church. We're often open to new ideas for mission. We've got 20 minutes, yeah?
Mm-hmm. That's when we start again.
Do we need to stop now?
Yeah.
Yes.
I apologise. We'll have a coffee break now. How long?
Till 25 minutes.
Okay.
So
I'm very sorry. 25-minute coffee break. See you back at the end of that.